The leopard was lying in the middle of the road when Arjun found her, not tucked against the embankment where an injured animal might drag itself to hide, not concealed beneath the thick roadside ferns where instinct would normally carry a wounded predator to suffer unseen. She was sprawled across the cracked and faded asphalt of a narrow mountain highway that wound through the Kumaon hills, like a scar through green skin. Her golden body stretched across the center line as though she had simply stopped mid-stride and collapsed, her ribs heaving in shallow, uneven contractions that made her spotted flanks ripple with each labored breath. A dark stain had spread beneath her, not the bright red of a fresh wound, but the deeper, thicker black of blood that had been pooling for hours, blood that had already begun to dry at its edges and attract the first tentative flies of the morning. Arjun Mehra, district forest officer for the Nainital Range, stopped his jeep 30 meters away and killed the engine. He did not step out immediately. He sat behind the wheel and studied the animal through the windshield with the careful, measured attention of a man who had spent 9 years learning when to move and when to be still. The forest around the road was barely awake. Mist clung to the sal trees in thin horizontal layers, drifting between the trunks like pale curtains drawn halfway across a darkened stage. The air that came through his cracked window was sharp with the bite of altitude and the clean mineral smell of wet stone, mixed with pine resin and the faint trace of wood smoke rising from a village somewhere far below the ridge. A barbet called from the canopy overhead, its repetitive, hollow note pulsing through the silence like a heartbeat that belonged to the forest itself rather than to any single bird. Nothing else moved. The road in both directions was empty, no trucks grinding up the switchbacks, no motorbikes weaving through the fog. There was only the leopard and the man, separated by 30 meters of broken asphalt and the vast, complicated space between a wild animal's fear and a human's desire to help. He could see the wound from where he sat. A long, ragged gash ran along her right flank, beginning just behind the shoulder and curving downward toward the belly in a crescent shape that exposed the dark, wet red of muscle beneath the torn fur. The edges of the wound were uneven and pulled apart by gravity and the swelling of the surrounding tissue, and along its length the fur was matted and stiff with dried blood that had clumped into dark spikes. Her right hind leg was bent at an angle that no healthy joint would permit. The lower portion twisted slightly outward with the kind of displacement that suggested a fracture somewhere below the knee. Road rash raw, pink, weeping patches where the fur had been scraped entirely away covered her right shoulder and the bony ridge of her hip, as though she had been thrown and had skidded across the rough surface before coming to rest in this terrible, exposed position. Arjun reached for the radio clipped to the dashboard mount. His fingers were steady, but his jaw was tight, and when he spoke, his voice carried a controlled tension that anyone who knew him would have recognized as the sound of a man holding urgency at arm's length. He reported his position, described the animal and the injuries he could see, and requested veterinary support from the Haldwani Wildlife Clinic. Dr. Priya Sharma was on rotation. She was 45 minutes away under ideal conditions, but the mountain road with its hairpin turns and eroded shoulders would stretch that closer to an hour. An hour was too long. Arjun knew the mathematics of exposure. In an hour, a logging truck could come around the blind curve above him and be on top of the leopard before the driver's foot found the brake. In an hour, the village dogs that roamed the forest fringe in loose, emboldened packs would catch the scent of blood on the warming air and come to investigate with the mindless courage that domestic animals carry into encounters with creatures they do not understand. In an hour, someone from the village could wander up the road and find the leopard, and then would come the phones, the photographs, the gathering crowd pressing closer with voices that would push the injured animal past the edge of endurance into panic or shock or both. He stepped out of the jeep slowly, placing his boots on the gravel with deliberate care and leaving the door open behind him so that the sound of it closing would not carry across the still morning air. The leopard's ears moved immediately. They rotated toward him like two soft, furred satellites adjusting to a new signal, tracking his position with a precision that her broken body could no longer physically match. Her eyes opened wider. They were the color of raw honey held before firelight, deep amber ringed with black, and they fixed upon him with an expression that was not aggression and not submission and not the blind terror of a trapped animal. It was something more difficult to name, something that lived in the narrow space between assessment and exhaustion, as though she was measuring not whether he was dangerous but whether she had the strength left to care if he was. Arjun understood that look. He had seen it before, in the eyes of leopards pulled from wells, released from wire snares, cornered on the rooftops of village homes they had entered by accident and could not leave. It was the look of a predator confronting the single experience its evolution had never prepared it for helplessness. He walked to the rear of the jeep, retrieved 2 reflective warning triangles from the equipment box, and carried them up the road. He placed one 50 meters ahead of the leopard and one 50 meters behind, their orange faces angled to catch the headlights of any vehicle that might approach. It was a small gesture, almost bureaucratic in its practicality, but it was the first thing he could do, and so he did it with care. Then he returned to the jeep, sat down on the running board with his back against the open door frame, and waited. The mist thinned as the minutes passed. The barbet continued its solitary call. The blood beneath the leopard darkened further as the air touched it, turning from black to a deep oxidized brown at the edges, while remaining wet and dark at the center where it still seeped from the wound in slow, rhythmic pulses that matched the shallow rise and fall of her breathing. She had not moved. She had not tried to rise or crawl or drag herself toward the cover of the forest that began just 3 meters from the road's edge. She lay with her chin resting on the cold asphalt and her damaged leg held motionless behind her, and her eyes half open, watching the man who sat on the running board of his jeep with his hands resting on his knees. "I see you," Arjun said softly, not because she could understand the words or because speaking would change anything that was about to happen, but because the silence between a suffering animal and a waiting man can become a weight that presses on the chest, and sometimes the only way to carry that weight is to break it with the smallest, quietest sound a human voice can make. "I see you." The sun had not yet cleared the ridge. The road remained empty. Somewhere below, in the layered green of the forest that fell away from the highway in steep, terraced folds, a Himalayan thrush sang a single descending phrase and then stopped, as though reconsidering, and the leopard lay still in her widening circle of blood, breathing the sharp morning air of a mountain she had owned since birth, waiting with the patience of an animal that has no concept of rescue but knows, in some ancient and wordless way, that it is no longer alone. The clinic truck came around the bend at 7:14, its hazard lights pulsing amber through the last remnants of mist that still clung to the road's surface like something reluctant to leave. Dr. Priya Sharma stepped out before the vehicle had fully stopped, her boots striking the gravel shoulder with a sound that sent a pair of jungle babblers bursting from the roadside lantana in a flurry of brown wings and sharp, scolding calls. She was already reading the scene as she moved eyes tracking from the warning triangles to the dark stain on the asphalt to the spotted shape at its center, and by the time she reached Arjun's side, the calculations had already begun behind her calm, focused expression. Body weight, visible trauma surface area, respiratory rate measured across the distance by counting the rise and fall of the rib cage against the seconds ticking in her mind. Level of consciousness assessed by the position of the head, the openness of the eyes, the degree to which the ears still tracked sound. She carried a green canvas field bag over her left shoulder and a dart rifle in her right hand, the barrel pointed at the ground with the practiced, unconscious discipline of someone who had carried it 1,000 times before. She was not a large woman, but she moved with a kind of compressed authority that filled whatever space she entered. The quiet certainty of a person who had spent 15 years kneeling beside animals in crisis and had long ago learned that urgency and panic are not the same thing, and that only one of them saves lives. "How long has she been down?" she asked without looking away from the leopard. "Close to an hour since I found her, but the blood at the edges has been drying for longer than that. She was hit sometime in the night." Priya nodded once, a small, tight movement that acknowledged both the information and its implications. A leopard that had been lying on an exposed road surface for potentially 6 or 7 hours, without attempting to move to cover, was a leopard in serious physiological distress. The animal's stillness was not calm. It was the stillness of a body that had exhausted its reserves of adrenaline and cortisol, and was now operating on whatever remained, which was very little. She knelt behind the jeep, using its bulk as a visual screen between herself and the animal, and opened the dart rifle's breech. From the canvas bag she withdrew a small glass vial of ketamine and a second vial of xylazine, drawing measured amounts of each into the dart's chamber with a syringe. She paused twice during the preparation, recalculating the dosage against her estimate of the leopard's weight, adjusting downward to account for the blood loss that would have reduced circulating volume and increased the drug's effective concentration per kilogram. The margin between adequate sedation and respiratory depression narrowed with every hour an injured animal spent bleeding, and Priya worked within that margin the way a person walks a mountain trail at night carefully, feeling for the edge with each step. She braced the rifle against the Jeep's rear quarter panel, sighted through the scope, and fired. The dart crossed the distance in a flat, hissing arc and struck the leopard in the heavy muscle of the left shoulder. The animal flinched a single, violent contraction that lifted her head from the asphalt and pulled her lips back from her canines in a reflexive grimace, and then she settled again, her chin returning to the road, her breathing unchanged. For several minutes nothing visible happened, and the forest continued its mourning as though the small drama on the road was beneath its notice. Then the sedation arrived, not all at once, but in a slow, descending wave that moved through the leopard's body like water filling a vessel from the bottom upward. The rigid muscles along her spine softened first, the tight cords of tension releasing until her back flattened against the asphalt. Then her shoulders dropped, and the stiff, guarded posture of her neck unwound, and her jaw relaxed until her mouth fell slightly open, and her tongue, pale pink and dry, rested against the road surface. Her claws, which had been extended and pressed into the asphalt with the unconscious grip of an animal bracing against pain, retracted slowly into their sheaths with a faint series of clicks, like small doors closing one after another down a long hallway. Her eyes drifted shut. Her tail, which had been held rigid against her flank, went limp and curled loosely against the ground. Priya waited a full 3 minutes after the last visible sign of consciousness faded before she approached. She moved low and steady, her hand extended, and pressed 2 fingers against the leopard's ribcage just behind the left elbow, feeling for the heartbeat beneath the fur and muscle and bone. She counted silently, her lips moving, her eyes fixed on her watch. Elevated but holding. She's stable enough. We need to be quick. They laid out a canvas stretcher beside the leopard's body and rolled her onto it with the coordinated gentleness of people who understood that even an unconscious animal deserved to be handled as though it could feel every touch. She was heavier than she appeared, dense with the compact, coiled musculature that makes leopards the strongest climbers and most explosive ambush predators relative to their size of any big cat on Earth. Arjun took the front handles, Priya the rear, and they carried her to the back of the clinic truck, where a padded examination platform waited beneath a single overhead light powered by the vehicle's generator. Under that light, the full geography of her suffering became legible. The flank wound was the dominant feature, a ragged crescent nearly 30 centimeters long, its edges swollen and pulled apart to reveal the dark red striations of the intercostal muscles beneath, the tissue hot and angry with the beginning stages of infection, but mercifully intact over the chest cavity itself. The hind leg fracture was clean but displaced. The bone shifted beneath the skin in a way that would have made every step an exercise in extraordinary pain. Road rash covered the right shoulder and hip in raw, weeping patches where the fur had been completely abraded away, exposing the pink and glistening dermis beneath. But it was not the acute injuries that made Priya stop. It was the older evidence. Fine, healed scratches crisscrossed the leopard's forelimbs, the kind left by thorns encountered at speed or by the brief territorial skirmishes that punctuate a solitary predator's life. Her paw pads were cracked and worn smooth, polished by long distances traveled over hard, rocky ground. The fur along her belly was thinner than it should have been, rubbed sparse by repeated contact with stone surfaces, and her nipples were swollen and darkened, the tissue around them distended and soft with the unmistakable engorgement of active lactation, the skin warm to the touch even through Priya's gloves. She looked up at Arjun across the leopard's still body, and the words she spoke were quiet and careful, as though saying them too loudly might somehow make them worse. She's nursing. There are cubs. Young ones, probably less than 6 weeks based on the degree of lactation. She's been actively feeding them. The silence that followed was not empty. It was full of the sudden, terrible arithmetic of what the leopard's presence on the road now meant. She had not been wandering. She had not been lost or confused or simply crossing from one territory to another. She had been returning, moving through the night toward the small, hidden, helpless lives that depended on her body for warmth and her milk for survival, and something made of metal and speed and indifference had struck her down in the middle of that journey and left her broken on the asphalt while her cubs waited in the dark. Arjun looked at the leopard's face. Even in the artificial stillness of sedation, it held a quality he could not quite articulate, a kind of worn fierceness, the face of an animal that had been dragging itself forward on a shattered leg, not because it wanted to survive, but because something smaller than itself needed it to. The dried blood on her chest and forelegs was not all from the road wound. Some of it was older, darker, smeared in patterns that suggested she had been moving through brush and over rock for more than one night, reopening the wound with each effort, bleeding and stopping and bleeding again. "She didn't stop," he said, and his voice was rough in a way that had nothing to do with the cold air. "She was hit, and she kept going. She kept trying to get back to them." Priya had already turned back to the wound. She irrigated it with saline from a squeeze bottle, the clear fluid running pink as it carried debris and dried blood away from the exposed tissue. Her hands moved with a precision that was almost musical, each motion deliberate and complete, wasting nothing. She began suturing the deepest layer of the wound with absorbable thread, drawing the torn muscle back together in small, careful bites that would hold long enough for the body's own repair mechanisms to take over. She did not rush. She did not look up. "That's what mothers do," she said. The generator hummed its low, mechanical note. The overhead light cast a circle of clinical white over the padded platform and the spotted body upon it, leaving the edges of the truck bed in shadow. Outside, through the open rear doors, the Kumaon hills were visible in the growing morning light ridge after green ridge folding into the distance beneath a sky that had begun to clear from gray to a pale, tentative blue. The mist had burned away entirely now, and the road was warming, and somewhere in the forest below the highway, in a rock crevice or beneath a fallen trunk, or in whatever small, dark, hidden place, a leopard judges safe enough to leave the most vulnerable parts of herself. Small bodies lay pressed together in the growing cold, waiting for a warmth that had not come home. Priya was still working when Arjun made the decision. She had moved from suturing the deepest muscular layer of the flank wound to cleaning and debriding the road rash on the shoulder, her gloved hands moving in small, methodical circles that removed gravel and dead tissue with equal care, and the leopard lay motionless beneath her attention, her sedated breathing fogging the padded surface in faint, rhythmic clouds. The splint for the fractured leg was next padded aluminum braces and wrap bandaging that would immobilize the joint, while allowing enough circulation to prevent tissue death. It was precise, time-consuming work, and Priya did not need him for it. What she needed from him was something she had not asked for directly but had communicated with a single glance across the leopard's still body when she had spoken the word nursing, a glance that carried the weight of a question neither of them wanted to leave unanswered for longer than absolutely necessary. He took 2 junior rangers with him, Manoj Bisht, who had grown up in a village at the base of these hills and could read the forest floor the way a librarian reads an index, and Sita Rawat, who moved through dense undergrowth with a silence that consistently startled people who did not expect it from someone her size. Both had been waiting by the second vehicle, monitoring the radio and keeping the road clear of the occasional curious motorbike that slowed near the warning triangles. Both understood, without lengthy explanation, what they were about to do and why it could not wait. The search began at the point where the blood trail departed the road. Arjun found it on the downhill side of the highway, on the gravel shoulder that crumbled away into the steep, forested slope below a series of dark drops, irregular in spacing and size, some no larger than a thumbprint, and others smeared into elongated streaks where a dragging limb had pulled through them. The trail led downward into the tree line, and its direction confirmed what Arjun had already suspected. The leopard had not been struck while climbing up to the road. She had been crossing it, moving from the forest on the upper side to the forest on the lower, traveling along a route she had probably used dozens of times before, a route that led from hunting ground to den site through the narrow corridor of asphalt that human engineering had laid across her territory like a blade. They descended from the road in a careful diagonal, following the blood trail where it remained visible on stone and exposed soil, and reading the forest where it disappeared into leaf litter too thick and too dark to hold a stain. The signs were there if one knew how to look, and Manoj knew. A broken fern stem, its green fibers freshly torn and already beginning to brown at the edges. A smear of something dark encrusted on the pale, exposed root of a rhododendron that arched across their path like a gnarled hand. Disturbed leaf litter where something heavy had passed through and scattered the neat layers that weeks of accumulation had built. Claw marks on the soft bark of a young sal tree where the leopard had apparently braced herself, perhaps stumbling, perhaps resting, perhaps simply trying to remain upright on a leg that could no longer bear her weight. The forest closed around them as they descended. The canopy thickened overhead, weaving sal and oak and wild cherry into a living ceiling that transformed the morning light from the pale, open brightness of the road into a filtered, green-gold luminescence that shifted and moved with every breath of wind through the upper branches. The understory was dense with ferns, wild ginger, and the broad, dark leaves of elephant ear plants that grew in clusters around the bases of the older trees. Moisture hung in the air, not mist exactly, but a heaviness, a saturation that clung to the skin and made every surface gleam. The smell was layered and complex, decomposing leaves forming a rich, sweet earthiness beneath the sharper notes of pine resin, crushed herbs, and the faint, musky trace of animal passage that Arjun had learned to detect not through any single identifiable scent but through a general quality of the air that was somehow different, somehow occupied, in places where wild creatures moved regularly. Langurs called from somewhere in the middle canopy, sharp, whooping alarm calls that rippled outward from the group's position in expanding circles of warning, announcing the presence of upright figures moving through the understory below. A Himalayan thrush sang a single descending phrase from a branch Arjun could not see, 3 clear notes falling like drops of water from a height, and then stopped as though it had reconsidered the song and found the morning insufficient for it. The forest was not silent. It was full of small, layered sounds, the ticking of insects, the distant knock of a woodpecker, the soft, continuous rustle of leaves adjusting to the breeze, but these sounds formed a kind of living, quiet, a baseline hum against which any interruption would register immediately. They had covered nearly 400 meters down the slope when Arjun raised his hand and stopped. Manoj and Sita froze behind him, their bodies going still with the trained, instant response of people who understood that in the forest, the person at the front stops for a reason, and you do not ask what it is until the silence has had time to deliver its message. Arjun tilted his head slightly, orienting his right ear toward the slope below, and listened. There it was. Not a bird, not the wind, not the creaking of a branch or the rustle of a foraging animal in the leaf litter. It was higher than any of those sounds, thinner, more thread-like, and it carried a quality that was unmistakable to anyone who had ever heard a young animal in distress, a trembling, wavering pitch that rose and fell not with rhythm but with the irregular, desperate cadence of lungs that were too small and too tired to sustain a proper cry. Then a second voice joined the first, overlapping it, creating a ragged 2-part call that wove through the forest understory like the thinnest of threads being pulled taut until it nearly broke. Arjun pointed toward a rocky outcrop that jutted from the hillside 20 meters below their position. It was a formation of weathered gray stone, ancient and cracked, partially concealed behind a heavy curtain of hanging moss and wild ginger that draped across its face like a green veil. The sound was coming from behind it, or rather from within it, from some cavity or crevice in the rock that the vegetation had hidden from casual observation. He moved toward it slowly, placing each foot with deliberate precision on the uneven ground, and the others followed at a distance, giving him space. At the base of the outcrop, he crouched and carefully parted the moss with his hand. The fronds were cool and damp against his fingers, and they pulled away from the rock face with a soft, tearing sound that released a breath of warm, stale air from the space behind them. There was an opening, a horizontal crack in the stone, perhaps 40 centimeters high and just over half a meter wide, running along the base of the outcrop like a mouth pressed into a thin, reluctant line. The edges were smooth, worn by decades of weather and perhaps by the passage of animal bodies squeezing through. The air that emerged from it carried a concentrated warmth and a sharp, unmistakable scent, the dense, musky signature of leopard mixed with the sour sweetness of milk and the faintly metallic undertone of dried blood. Arjun switched on a small flashlight and angled its beam into the gap. The light entered the crevice and found, at the back of a shallow cavity no deeper than 1.5 meters, two small shapes pressed together against the bare stone. Two pairs of eyes reflected the beam back at him, round, oversized, the milky blue-gray of infant predators whose irises had not yet developed the amber pigmentation of adulthood. The cubs were huddled in a tight knot of spotted fur and thin limbs, their bodies pushed against each other on a bed of dry leaves and shed maternal fur that had once been warm and was now cold. They were shivering. A fine, constant tremor ran through both small bodies, visible even in the unsteady flashlight beam, and their mouths were open, producing those thin, wavering cries that had carried through the forest like distress signals, transmitted on a frequency almost too faint for the human ear to receive. They were tiny. Each one was smaller than a man's forearm, their heads disproportionately large, their paws oversized and soft, their tails short and blunt. Their fur was darker than their mother's, the rosettes not yet fully defined, existing as smudged, charcoal-colored patches against a background of dusky gold that would lighten and sharpen as they grew. If they grew, their body temperatures had dropped to a level that Arjun could feel even from the opening of the den. The air inside was cool, not warm, which meant the mother's body heat had been absent long enough for the small enclosed space to equalize with the surrounding forest. Without that warmth, the cubs' metabolisms were slowing. Without milk, their blood sugar was failing. They were past the stage of crying loudly, past the stage of wriggling and searching and calling with full-throated urgency. They were crying with whatever they had left, and what they had left was not much. Arjun pulled back from the opening and sat on his heels. He pressed one hand against his knee and took a single, slow breath. Then he unclipped the radio from his belt. "I've found them. 2 cubs, both alive, but they're cold, very cold." Priya's response came through the static without hesitation, her voice carrying the same measured calm that she applied to everything, though Arjun thought he could hear something tighter beneath it, something held carefully in check. "Bring them to me. Keep them against your body. Quickly." He removed his jacket, a worn olive-green field jacket lined with fleece that held the warmth of his own body in its fibers, and folded it into a soft, loose cradle. He reached into the den with both hands, moving with a slowness that ached in his muscles because every part of him wanted to move faster, and his fingers found the first cub. It weighed almost nothing. It was like lifting a handful of warm leaves, except that it was alive and trembling, and its small heart was beating against his palm in a rapid, fluttering rhythm that felt too fast and too fragile to sustain. It did not struggle. It did not cry louder or try to pull away. It simply pressed its body into the warmth of his hands and went quiet, as though the heat of human skin was close enough to the heat of its mother that the difference, in its current state, did not matter. The second cub bit him, a small, instinctive nip as his fingers closed around its body, the tiny teeth barely denting the skin of his thumb, a reflex born not of aggression but of the last flicker of survival instinct firing in a body that was running out of fuel to sustain it. He held the cub gently against his chest beside its sibling, wrapped the jacket around them both, and stood. He could feel them through the fabric, 2 small bundles of trembling warmth, their breathing shallow and fast, their bodies curled against each other and against him with the blind, urgent need of creatures who had been alone in the cold for too long and had found something warm and were holding on to it with everything they had. "We're going to your mother," he said softly, and the words were not for the cubs, who could not understand them, but for himself, because the climb back up the slope was steep and the jacket in his arms was light, but the weight of what it held was enormous, and sometimes a man needs to hear his own voice say the right thing in order to keep his legs moving in the right direction. The 400 meters back to the road was the longest distance Arjun had ever covered in the Kuman Hills. The first cub was failing when Arjun reached the truck. He could feel it through the jacket, a change in the quality of the small body's trembling, a shift from the active, rhythmic shivering that indicated a metabolism still fighting to generate heat to something slower, more intermittent, more like the irregular flickering of a flame running out of fuel. The cub's breathing had become shallow enough that Arjun had to press his hand flat against the folded fabric to confirm it was still there, still rising and falling, still carrying oxygen to a brain and a heart that were operating on reserves so thin they could be measured in minutes rather than hours. Priya took them from him without a word. She had cleared a space on the examination platform beside the leopard's still body and laid out a fleece cloth, a warmed saline bag, and a small syringe filled with electrolyte solution. Her movements as she unwrapped the jacket were swift but controlled, the kind of speed that comes not from panic but from an intimate understanding of how narrow the window is and how little time remains to climb through it. She placed the first cub, the quieter one, the one that had stopped crying on the climb and had simply pressed itself into Arjun's warmth with a passivity that frightened him more than any struggle would have on the fleece cloth, and immediately positioned the saline bag against its belly. The bag had been warmed in a basin of hot water and wrapped in a thin towel to prevent burns, and its gentle, radiating heat began to transfer into the cub's body through the soft skin of its abdomen, where the blood vessels ran closest to the surface. The cub did not respond at first. It lay on the fleece, with its limbs drawn in and its eyes sealed shut, its small chest moving in hitched, uneven cycles that occasionally paused long enough to make Priya's hands go still before they resumed. Its gums, when she gently pulled back its lip to check, were pale, not the healthy pink of adequate circulation, but a washed-out, grayish color that spoke of blood being redirected away from the extremities and the surface tissues toward the vital organs at the core, the body's last defensive strategy when warmth and energy were running critically low. She covered it with a second layer of fleece and turned to the other cub. The second one, the biter, the one with the marginally stronger vital signs, was in better condition, though better was a relative term that still fell well short of safe. It was warmer to the touch, its shivering more vigorous, and when Priya placed it on the examination surface, it opened its mouth and produced a thin, reedy cry that was more air than sound, but that carried, unmistakably, the quality of protest rather than surrender. Its limbs moved, its head turned, searching blindly for something warm and soft and familiar. It was still fighting, and fighting was the difference between a body that could be brought back and one that was drifting beyond reach. Priya fed them both with careful, measured patience. She drew warm electrolyte solution into a small syringe, no needle, just the plastic barrel and plunger, and placed the tip at the corner of each cub's mouth, depressing the plunger in tiny increments that released single drops onto the tongue. The cubs swallowed reflexively, their small throats working in visible, convulsive movements, their sealed eyes scrunching tighter with each swallow, as though the act of taking in liquid required the concentration of their entire bodies. She gave them barely 5 milliliters, each enough to raise blood sugar, enough to provide hydration, not enough to overwhelm digestive systems that had been empty for too long. Then she wrapped them together in the fleece, placed the saline bag between them, and covered the small bundle with a second cloth. Within 20 minutes, the change was visible. The first cub's breathing had steadied, its chest rising and falling in a slower, more regular rhythm that no longer carried the frightening pauses. Its shivering had intensified, which was counterintuitively a good sign. A body that shivers vigorously is a body with enough energy to generate heat, and the transition from weak tremors to strong ones meant the glucose from the electrolyte solution was reaching the muscles. The second cub had begun to move its limbs in small, searching motions, its forepaws kneading the fleece with an instinctive, rhythmic pressing that was the newborn echo of the behavior it would use to stimulate milk flow from its mother's body. It was looking for her, not with sight, not with conscious thought, but with the deep, encoded certainty of a creature whose entire neurological framework was built around one primary signal: the smell, the warmth, the heartbeat of the animal that meant survival. Priya lifted them carefully and placed them inside the large recovery kennel where the leopard lay. The mother was still under sedation, her sutured flank rising and falling with the deep, mechanical rhythm of chemically induced unconsciousness, her splinted leg immobilized and wrapped, her road-rash shoulder cleaned and dressed, with a light gauze that would protect the raw tissue without trapping heat. She was warm. Her body temperature, maintained by the heating pad beneath the kennel's bedding, radiated outward through her fur in a gentle, steady field of warmth that the cubs found immediately. They crawled toward her, blind, wobbling, moving in unsteady circles that gradually tightened as the scent grew stronger. They pushed across the bedding with their oversized paws until they found her belly. They pressed themselves against her with an urgency that had nothing of desperation in it and everything of arrival, their small bodies fitting into the curve of her abdomen as though the space had been shaped specifically for them, which in a sense it had. Their mouths found her nipples, and they began to nurse small, rhythmic, suckling sounds that filled the quiet truck with a pulse so soft and so fundamental that it seemed to come not from the cubs themselves, but from somewhere deeper, somewhere beneath sound, like the first heartbeat of something beginning. Then the team waited. The reversal agent had been administered, and the leopard's body was already beginning to surface from the sedation in slow, incremental waves. Her ear twitched. The tip of her tail curled and uncurled in a languid, involuntary rhythm. Her nostrils flared slightly, pulling in air that carried new information: antiseptic, metal, rubber, human sweat, the generator's oily exhaust, and beneath all of it, woven through it like a thread of gold through gray cloth, the scent of her own cubs against her own body. Arjun stood at the far side of the truck bed, his back against the metal wall. Manoj and Sita watched from the open rear doors. Priya remained closest, seated on a low stool beside the kennel, one hand resting on the wire mesh of the door, her body positioned so that she could monitor the leopard's vital signs by sight: the rate of respiration, the color of the gums, the degree of muscle tone returning to the limbs. The leopard's eyes opened. They were clouded at first, the pupils dilated wide from the ketamine, the amber irises reduced to thin rings around pools of black that reflected the overhead light in flat, glassy discs. She blinked. The motion was slow, effortful, as though her eyelids were heavier than they should have been. She blinked again, and the clouds began to thin. Her jaw moved, her tongue pressed against her teeth. Her nostrils flared again, wider this time, pulling in a long, deliberate breath that expanded her rib cage and pressed the sutured wound against its dressing in a way that must have produced pain, but that she gave no outward sign of registering. She looked down, her head turned on the bedding, rotating with the careful stiffness of an animal relearning the dimensions of its own body, and her gaze fell on the two small shapes pressed against her belly. The cubs were still nursing, their eyes still sealed, their small mouths working in rhythmic pulses, their bodies warm now and no longer trembling. They were oblivious to the significance of the moment. They knew only that the warmth had returned, and the milk was flowing, and the surface beneath them rose and fell with a rhythm they recognized at a level deeper than memory. The leopard did not panic. She did not snarl. She did not lunge against the kennel walls or snap at the wire mesh or flatten her ears against her skull in the defensive posture that every textbook and every field guide would have predicted from a wild predator waking in a confined space surrounded by humans and the unfamiliar sounds and smells of captivity. Every instinct that millions of years of evolution had sharpened into a set of automatic, non-negotiable survival responses: fight, flee, freeze, defend, simply did not engage. Instead, she lowered her head and began to groom the nearest cub. Her tongue, still sluggish from the sedation, moved across the small body in long, deliberate strokes that began at the crown of the head and traveled down the spine to the base of the tail. It was not the frantic, desperate grooming of a mother reunited with offspring she feared were lost. It was slow. It was thorough. It was the grooming of a mother confirming that what she had left behind was still here, still whole, still hers. She pulled the cub closer with her forepaw, the claws retracted, the pads pressing gently against the small body's side, and then she reached for the second cub and drew it in as well, gathering both against her chest in a single, curving motion that arranged them exactly where they needed to be: warm, close, enclosed within the arc of her body like two small lives held inside a parenthesis. Then she raised her head and looked across the kennel. She looked directly at Arjun. The distance between them was less than 3 meters. He was standing against the wall with his hands at his sides and his jacket still missing, and the thin, dried blood from the cub's bite visible on his right thumb. He had not moved since she woke. He had not spoken. He had barely breathed. And now her eyes found him, those amber eyes, clearing rapidly now, the pupils contracting as the drug released its hold. the irises brightening into the deep, luminous gold of a fully conscious leopard, and she held his gaze. She did not growl. She did not look away. She did not flatten her ears, or curl her lip, or display any of the signals that a leopard uses to communicate threat, or fear, or territorial challenge. She simply looked at him, and the look held, and in the holding there was something that every person in that truck recognized, even though none of them could have defined it with language precise enough to satisfy a scientist. It was not gratitude, because gratitude requires abstraction and narrative and a concept of debt that no animal possesses. It was not love, because love, in the human sense, requires a self-awareness that the leopard's brain was not structured to produce. It was something older than either of those things and simpler and more direct. It was recognition, the acknowledgement of one living creature by another across the vast divide of species and instinct and fear, an acknowledgement that said nothing and meant everything, that this particular human carried the scent of her den and the warmth of her cubs, and had been present in the worst moment of her life, and had not caused harm. The room was silent. Nobody moved. The generator hummed. The cubs nursed. And the leopard held Arjun's gaze for 5 full seconds, an eternity in the currency of eye contact between predator and human, before she lowered her head, rested her chin on her forepaws, and closed her eyes. Priya looked at Arjun. His hand was pressed against his mouth. His eyes were bright and full, and he was blinking rapidly in the way that people blink when they are trying very hard to hold something inside that the body wants to release. "She knows," Priya said softly. He nodded. He could not speak. He stood against the wall of the truck and pressed his hand harder against his mouth and watched the leopard sleep with her cubs held against her chest, and the morning light came through the open doors and touched the floor of the truck bed in a long, pale rectangle that slowly widened as the sun climbed higher over the hills, and the world outside continued, as it always does, indifferent and beautiful and vast, while inside the small space of the clinic truck something had happened that no report would adequately capture and no photograph would have been fast enough to catch, something that lived now only in the bodies of the people who had been present and in the quiet, breathing stillness of a leopard who had woken among strangers and chosen, against every law of her nature, not to be afraid. The morning they chose for the release was the kind that the Kumaon Hills produce only rarely, when the monsoon is still weeks away, and the winter has fully released its grip, and the air exists in a state of perfect suspension between seasons, cool enough to carry scent cleanly through the forest, warm enough to make the undergrowth hum with insect life, still enough that the sal leaves hung motionless on their branches like 10,000 green hands held open to the sky. A thin layer of cloud covered the sun without obscuring it, diffusing the light into a soft, even luminescence that eliminated shadows and gave every surface, bark, stone, soil, leaf the same gentle, unhurried clarity. It was not dramatic weather. It was quiet weather, the kind that asks nothing of the creatures who move through it and offers everything. 3 weeks had passed since the road. In that time, the leopard's body had done what wild bodies do when the immediate threat of death is removed, and the ancient machinery of healing is allowed to operate without interruption. The flank wound had closed from the inside outward, the sutured muscle knitting together beneath a layer of new tissue that was pink and tight and tender but structurally sound. Priya had removed the external stitches on day 12, revealing a scar that ran along the leopard's right side like a river drawn on a map, permanent, visible, but no longer open. The fractured leg had mended well enough for the splint to come off on day 16, and though the leopard still favored it slightly, carrying a fraction less weight on the right hind than on the left, she had begun pacing the length of her recovery enclosure with an increasing tempo and intensity that told the team everything they needed to know. A leopard that paces is not exercising. A leopard that paces is measuring the distance between itself and the world it belongs to, and finding the walls intolerable. The cubs had changed almost beyond recognition. 3 weeks of steady nursing from a mother whose milk production had fully restored, supplemented in the early days by the electrolyte feeds, and later by the small portions of raw meat that Priya introduced to begin the long transition to solid food, had transformed them from the trembling, hypothermic fragments of life that Arjun had carried up the ridge in his jacket into something altogether more substantial. They had doubled in size. Their eyes had opened pale green with vertical pupils that widened and narrowed in constant, fascinated response to every moving shadow and shifting light source in their environment. Their coordination had progressed from the helpless, swimming movements of neonates to the exaggerated, unsteady pouncing and tumbling of young predators, learning to operate bodies that had been engineered for explosive power but had not yet developed the neurological precision to deploy it. They stalked their mother's tail. They wrestled each other into corners of the enclosure with a ferocity that was entirely genuine and entirely harmless. They stared at the humans who came to check on them with an unblinking intensity that was part curiosity and part something older, something that would eventually become the focused, calculating attention of an apex predator, but was for now simply the wide, absorbing gaze of young animals, encountering a world that was endlessly, overwhelmingly new. The team drove the recovery kennel down from the Haldwani clinic in the back of the same white truck that had served as the roadside operating theater 3 weeks earlier. They took the mountain highway south and then turned onto a Forest Service road that descended through a series of switchbacks into the valley below the ridge where the den had been found. The release site had been chosen carefully, a clearing at the base of the rocky slope, 200 meters from the overhang where the cubs had waited in the cold, well within the leopard's established home range and far enough from the highway that the sound of traffic was reduced to a faint, intermittent whisper that the forest absorbed and softened into something almost inaudible. They set the kennel down on level ground between two mature sal trees whose canopies interlocked overhead, forming a natural archway that framed the forest beyond in layers of receding green. Arjun, Priya, Manoj, and Sita positioned themselves in a loose semicircle 15 meters from the kennel door, far enough to give the animal space and close enough to observe. Nobody spoke. The protocol for a big cat release is simple and old and does not require discussion. Open the door, step back, and let the animal decide. Everything that happens after belongs to the forest. Priya walked forward and unlatched the kennel door. The mechanism released with a metallic click that sounded unnaturally loud in the still morning air. She swung the door open, a slow, wide arc that left the entire front of the kennel exposed, and then retreated to the group with quick, quiet steps that left barely a mark in the soft forest soil. For a long moment, nothing happened. The opening was a dark rectangle against the green and brown of the clearing, and inside it the leopard was a shape without edges, invisible in the shadow the way leopards have always been invisible when they choose to be. The team could hear her breathing measured, steady, fully alert, and the faint rustling of the cubs shifting against her body. A barbet called from somewhere in the canopy, the same species whose hollow, metronomic note had accompanied the morning of the rescue, as though the forest had sent the same bird to mark both the beginning and the end. A paw appeared at the threshold, one spotted forelimb, extended with deliberate care onto the ground outside the kennel, the toes spreading as the pads made contact with soil for the first time in 21 days. The claws flexed once, gripping the earth, testing its texture and its give, reading the information it contained in the way that a predator reads every surface it touches: temperature, moisture, the faint vibrations of other creatures moving nearby, the chemical signatures of territorial markings and prey trails, and the vast invisible map of scent that overlays the forest floor like a second landscape visible only to those equipped to perceive it. A second paw followed. Then the head emerged, the broad, flat skull with its short, rounded ears and its wide-set eyes, the amber irises catching the filtered light and igniting into gold, and then the body flowed out of the kennel in a single, continuous pour of muscle and fur, and recovered grace that seemed to make the kennel itself smaller, as though the container had been holding something far larger than its dimensions should have allowed. She stood in the clearing and breathed. Her nostrils flared wide, pulling in the forest in long, deep inhalations that expanded her ribcage and pressed the healed scar against the air. Her ears rotated independently, scanning the canopy, the understory, the rocky slope above, each one moving with the precise, mechanical efficiency of a radar dish sweeping a sector. Her tail hung low behind her, swaying in a slow, balanced arc, and her eyes moved across the clearing, the trees, the undergrowth, and the four humans standing in their silent semicircle with an expression that contained no readable emotion, only the absolute, focused attention of a wild animal reassessing the boundaries of its world. She did not look back at the kennel. She did not look back at the humans. There was no pause, no lingering, no moment of cinematic hesitation at the threshold between captivity and freedom. Leopards do not mark transitions. They do not frame the present against the past. They move forward because forward is the only direction that the body of a predator is designed to travel, and this leopard moved forward now with a stride that began cautiously, the healed leg carrying its share of weight with only the faintest asymmetry, a ghost of a limp that would fade entirely within days and then lengthened into the fluid, ground-covering walk that is the leopard's default mode of travel, the gait that can carry it 20 kilometers in a night across terrain that would exhaust a human in 2. She crossed the clearing in 6 strides and reached the edge of the undergrowth, where the sal trees thickened and the ferns rose to waist height and the green closed in like a curtain being drawn. She paused there not to look back, but to scent a low-hanging branch, pressing her cheek against the rough bark in the slow, rubbing motion that deposits the chemical markers of ownership and presence. She was reclaiming her territory, reasserting the invisible borders that had gone unpatrolled for 3 weeks, announcing to every creature with the olfactory equipment to receive the message that the leopard who lived here had returned. Then she stepped into the forest and vanished, not gradually, not in stages, but all at once, the way a stone disappears into deep water one moment present, the next moment gone, absorbed into the green with a completeness that made the clearing feel suddenly emptier than it had any right to feel. The cubs followed. They tumbled out of the kennel in a tangle of oversized paws and uncoordinated legs, blinking in the soft light, their nostrils working furiously as the full, overwhelming symphony of the forest hit their senses for the first time. Earth and bark and decomposing leaves and fungal spores and animal musk and flower pollen, and the 100 other layers of scent that a young leopard must learn to parse if it is to survive. They were unsteady on the uneven ground, their paws sinking into soil that behaved differently from the flat, predictable surface of the kennel floor, and they stumbled and recovered and stumbled again with the determined, graceless persistence of youth. They followed their mother's scent trail to the edge of the undergrowth, hesitated for a single, wobbling moment at the border between the open clearing and the dense green wall of the forest, and then pushed through the ferns and disappeared after her, their small spotted bodies swallowed by the undergrowth as cleanly and as completely as hers had been. The ferns settled. A single frond, bent by the passage of the last cub, slowly straightened and returned to its original position. The clearing was empty. The kennel stood open and vacant, its interior still holding the faint warmth and scent of the animals it had sheltered. The barbet called once more from the canopy and then fell silent, as though its work for the morning was finished. Arjun stood at the edge of the tree line for a long time after the others had begun walking back toward the truck. Priya paused beside him as she passed and rested her hand on his shoulder for a moment, a brief, wordless gesture that carried the weight of shared experience and required no elaboration, and then continued on. Manoj and Sita followed, their boots crunching softly on the fallen leaves, their voices low and indistinct as they loaded the empty kennel into the truck bed. He was not waiting for the leopard to return. He knew she would not, and he understood that her not returning was the entire point, that the measure of a successful rescue is not the animal's attachment to its rescuers, but its complete and immediate willingness to leave them behind. The goal was always this: the open door, the empty clearing, the forest closing around a life that had been borrowed briefly and returned in full. Everything else was just the work required to reach this moment. But he stood there anyway, because some moments ask to be inhabited fully before they are released. And this was one of them. The air was still and warm, and it carried the green, living scent of the sal forest and the distant, clean smell of the higher ridges where snow still lingered in the deepest shadows. A thrush sang from somewhere unseen, 3 descending notes, clear and unhurried, falling through the canopy like drops of water from a great height. The clouds shifted, and a single column of pale gold light broke through and touched the place where the leopard had stood, warming the soil for a moment in a small, bright circle that held its shape and then dissolved as the clouds closed again and the forest returned to its soft, even gray-green light. "Go well," he said quietly. The words left him and entered the trees and were absorbed by the forest, the way the forest absorbs everything without ceremony, without echo, with the patient, encompassing silence of something that has been receiving the sounds of living creatures for longer than any living creature can comprehend. The ferns did not move, the clearing did not answer, and somewhere beyond the green curtain of the undergrowth, already invisible, already receding into the layered depth of a world that humans are permitted to visit but never to own, a leopard walked on steady legs through her recovered territory with two small lives following close behind her, and the forest took them back the way it takes back everything it has ever held, completely, quietly, and without condition. Arjun turned and walked to the truck. He did not look over his shoulder. He did not need to. The moment was not behind him. It was inside him now, the weight of a small body in his hands. The amber gaze held without fear across the width of a kennel, the sound of two thin voices crying in the dark beneath a rocky overhang, and it would remain there, carried quietly alongside everything else that made him who he was, for as long as he had left to carry it. The engine started. The truck pulled away down the forest road, its tires crunching over gravel and fallen leaves. The clearing stood empty in the soft morning light, holding nothing but the faint impression of paw prints in the soil, and the memory of a door swinging open, and a golden shape flowing through it into the green. The thrush sang again. The wind moved through the sal canopy in a long, slow wave that traveled from one end of the valley to the other, touching every leaf once and then passing on, carrying with it the scent of earth and rain and the quiet, breathing wildness of a forest that had lost something and gotten it back and would go on standing, as it always had, long after the sound of the engine faded and the road fell silent and the morning gave way to the long, warm, unhurried afternoon.